Now I'd like to give you some examples, 5 examples of psychologists who are interested in developmental psychology, either in the form of developing children or, as you will see in some cases, the kind of lifelong development, not necessarily limited to the time before adulthood, but continuing throughout the life of a person. And I think this is something quite important, not only because statistically most of you will become parents in later life, but also regarding the kind of studies that you have chosen, many of you very likely will be involved in the teaching of people. It could be any kind of teaching. Perhaps some of you have already worked as language teachers or will work as language teachers later in your professional careers. So you might work with children or you might work with adults, and especially if we look at the developmental psychology beyond childhood, it is quite interesting to understand that according to many psychologists, human development does not end with gaining biological maturity. You still have what is called the psychosocial development, which continues throughout the human life. So we'll talk about it in a little moment. So the first psychologist I'd like to draw your attention to is the founder of cognitivist psychology called Jean Piaget. He was mostly interested in the philosophy called in the subfield of philosophy called epistemology. Epistemology is interested in the nature of knowledge, so how people gain knowledge. He was mostly interested in children, in the development of children, and he formulated a theory which he called a developmental stage theory. So for him, children develop in stages. So the first stage, which he established to happen in the first 2 years of life, he called the sensory motor stage. So the coordination of senses. The first skill that a baby needs to master is to coordinate the data coming from the natural senses. Then 2 to 7-year-olds pre-operational stage. So this is the moment when children learn language, when they learn some cultural symbols. So it is quite important. They start to identify with the culture that they live in. This is the stage characterized by a degree of egocentrism. Little children between the ages of 2 and 7 tend to focus on themselves, tend to focus on their own needs. They tend to voice their demands if they need something, if they like something, if they don't like something. For Piaget, this is a very natural stage which allows the child to develop this pre-operational skills of language and symbols. So the first, of course, initial levels of learning these things. Then, let's say, the primary school years, 7 to 12-year-old, concrete operational stage according to Piaget's terminology, and this is learning the skill of logical problem solving. So we have children going to schools, they start to learn specific subjects, so they are faced with different kinds of problems and instructed to look for logical ways to solve them. Then from 12-year-olds onwards to maturity and then in adult life, formal operational stage, which means developing the skill of abstract thinking, verbal intelligence, so communicating with other people. This idea, this theory, allowed Jean Piaget to postulate what he called open education. So more flexible learning schemes, emotional involvement, the greater inclusion of personal choice and collaborative group work in the education of children. He believed this would really benefit the children better. So if we look at some theories of learning, they are basically based on those psychological theories, and the methodology of learning different skills, like a foreign language, for example, also develops from these psychological the psychological research. The next psychologist I'd like to draw your attention to was called Erik Erikson, and he worked very often in collaboration with his wife Joan Erikson, and his theory is called the theory of psychosocial development. And they were the psychologists who were not really focusing on children as such, but they believed that humans develop throughout their life. So even if you are an elderly person, you still develop certain skills, and the progress never stops. And especially this kind of social adjustment, social development never really stops for human beings. So it isn't only about children, it's about humans as such. So the Eriksons introduced a kind of 8-level scale with some age differences, and the most important focus points, and the most important philosophical problems to be resolved in these stages. So the first one, which they call the hope stage in the first 2 years, so it's like the sensory-motor stage. The most important person with whom to interact is, of course, the mother or the primary caregiver, and the skill that a child has to develop at this stage is the kind of tension between trust and mistrust. So who do you trust and who you shouldn't? Then between the ages of 2 and 4, we have the phase named after will, so this kind of volition, what you want, and the child interacts with the parents. So as you can see, it's kind of a growing circles of interaction from only the mother to the parents as a pair, and the child has to sort out the question of autonomy versus shame. What is allowed in the culture they grow in, and what is not allowed, what is shamed. Then 4 to 5 years of age, the entire family is included, and the child has to learn initiative and guilt. So the interaction with larger and larger circles of people. Then the early school years, let's say, so 5 to 12, industry and inferiority. This is the moment when a child interacts with the neighbors, so the local community. This is also the moment when in Western cultures most children go to school. So this is another field of interaction. Then the teenagers, the fidelity phase, in which the children or the young people develop their social identity, so they have to maneuver the identity and role confusion by interacting with the peers, so the young people of similar age. This is really when The opinion of the peers becomes very important for the young people, more important in most cases than the opinion of parents or family members or teachers or anyone. They learn from their colleagues, from their peers, and also role models. So the authorities they accept and they try to imitate. As you can see, it does not end there. So from age 19 to roughly 35, we have the phase called love, in which the young person has to maneuver their psychology between intimacy and isolation. So the needs to be in a close relationship and to be left alone, and this is mostly done through interaction with partners and friends. This is mostly the time when people get married. They get involved in sexual relationships, in romantic relationships. They start work, they form the circles of friends that sometimes will last for many years. Then two more stages. As you can see, they all happen in adult life. So the stage called care, the majority of adult life from 35 to 65, generativity and stagnation, and the fields of interaction are work and parenthood. This is the moment when many people have families with children, later with grandchildren, so they give care, they also receive care within a family circle that they have created themselves, and also they continue to work, they continue to interact on a professional level. And the last phase for the Eriksons is called wisdom, and it's the last stage of life, so the older age, which they say start around 65, and it's the moment of the reflection on life and not giving in to despair, but kind of developing ego integrity. So as you can see, for many psychologists, there is always the way to develop, there is always the way of progress. Another three more slides. The next one, Albert Bandura, social learning theory. You may want to Google the term the Bobo doll experiment. This was a very famous psychological experiment which was conducted by Bandura in the 1960s. And it was based on observing children's reaction to a big doll, a kind of soft doll, and before they were allowed to interact with the doll themselves, they watched a film in which an adult hit the doll, hit the toy. And many children later on mimicked the actions of the adult model, so they also hit the toy, so they displayed some aggressive behavior towards this toy after observing it. So Bandura believed that learning is not purely behavioral, it is a cognitive process. So it is acquiring knowledge, it is not done through just learning behaviors, but mostly through observation of different channels, so life models, verbal instruction, and symbolic models, mostly through the media, for example. The next very holistic psychological theory is the theory of ego development by Jane Levinger, and like the Eriksons, it does not end with the end of childhood. We have 9 phases and only 4 first ones include childhood. So the pre-social phase for the baby and the early development, the impulsive phase for the egocentric small child. So as you can see, these things were observed by many psychologists. The self-protective phase for, let's say, preschoolers, when children need to learn self-control and the order of, well, they require discipline, they require the rules to develop. Then the conformist stage, she believes the most school children are in this, they have to learn obeying the rules. And then the first stage of maturity, which she believes is usually reached around 25 years of age, the self-aware stage, which focuses on interpersonal relations. And for Levinger, not all people, not all adults achieve all the stages. So some of them are just left in stage 5, some more educated or adapted socially go further through the conscientious stage, in which they have goals and ideals and they accept responsibility, or individualistic stage, which is characterized by a broader mind and more tolerance. And the last two stages, as Levinger wrote, were reached only by very few people, but these were the people who could become authorities and models for adults. So the autonomous stage, characterized by synthetic thinking, so higher cognitive skills and self-fulfillment, so like the top of Maslow's pyramid, if you remember. And the integrated stage, which she believed was rarely achieved only by the most developed people, and this was the phase characterized by wisdom and empathy. So of course this is something to strive towards and perhaps to do consciously in your own personal development, but not something to expect of every, let's say, adult or mature human being. The last thing I'd like to show you is this little table with the theory of parenting styles by Diana Baumrind. This could be true for parents. She first developed the theory about parents and children interacting, but it could also be true for teachers and students, teachers and pupils, especially when the learners are still young. But as you can see, these are two coordinates, so whether the teacher or parent is supportive or unsupportive, or whether a teacher or parent is demanding or undemanding. So the best way, according to Baumrind, to motivate somebody to learn, to develop, if it's a child that you bring up or if it's someone that you try to teach, is to be both supporting and demanding. So this is something that she called authoritative parenting. Authoritative means creating positive role models, positive authority. The parent is accepting and at the same time expects much of a child. The other three models, the authoritarian parenting, the permissive parenting, and the rejecting or neglecting parenting, are not as effective. They can actually harm a developing personality. So if one of these characteristics, or even both in case of rejecting or neglecting parenting, are not met. So let's say if the parent is demanding but unsupportive, then we have authoritarian parenting. This is very strict, very controlling, based on force, sometimes physical force even, very strict and power assertive, with little support and regard for the child's need. So these two sound similar, authoritative and authoritarian, but one is very positive, the other one is basically damaging and negative. Then if the parent is supportive but undemanding, so cares for the child but doesn't expect much of them. We have permissive parenting that does not really motivate the child enough, and it's very indulgent but provides no control or discipline or even some sort of positive motivation, so it's also not very good. In case that the parent or teacher are at the same time unsupportive and undemanding, it's basically rejection. So the child is neglected and left to their own devices, or the student is neglected and left to their own devices, and it also can be damaging, especially for young personalities who need some structure, who need the rules, the order, and this is something that I would suggest perhaps you take out as potential future teachers or parents, that you need to look out for these two characteristics, to be at the same time supportive and demanding, and not to fall into any of those traps. So yeah, that's it for this week, and next week we'll start another subject, which is religion. Thank you.